Well, congratulations. The recipient is Professor Margaret Stanley. And Margaret, I'd like to ask you a series of questions. The first one being, the greatest burden of disease for cervix cancer is in the Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia Pacific. And whereas the logistics for vaccination are highly organised and valued, the options for screening and treatment are underserved in many countries. So how can individual countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia Pacific address these 2030 goals of the WHO cervical cancer elimination campaign?
Well, it's a huge question. And the first thing one has to recognize is the tremendous diversity in what we're describing. This is a huge geography, probably more than a third of the world. So there will be massive differences in culture and attitudes in these different countries. Now, with vaccination via the EPI program is so well established. It has an infrastructure, and this means that it's delivered so effectively in these countries. Cervical cancer in many places is still not even recognized as a problem, because they need more data, they need more information, they need more discussion, and they also, to be blunt, need a different valuation of women's health, because this is very much a question of women's health and access to services. And I think the first thing that I would try and persuade people is that women's health is central to a successful society. They are the engine of society. Women are the ones who look after the old. They care for the young. In many countries, particularly in rural communities, they do the work in the fields. And when you lose that woman in a family, you lose the cohesion, you lose the meaning. The children are bereft, the old are left to suffer. So women's health has to be a major priority. And that, I think, is the first thing that has to be accepted by governments and policymakers. And then screening. This has been a nightmare ever since I got into the whole cervix cancer diagnostic and prognostic situation, way back at the start of my career. And there have been huge efforts, but they fail. And they fail because there's not a recognition of how complex organization of this will be. And also that it is, if delivered in the way that we've traditionally done it in developed countries, a very sophisticated operation. You need trained cytopathologists who can read the slides, see the morphological changes, make the diagnosis. Then you need people who are going to treat, and then you need to follow up the individuals. That pattern of activity underpins why it's been so successful in high-income countries. Replicating that in a low-income country is really very difficult. Now, it's not all gloom and doom, because several things have changed in the last decade, really. And I think one of the most important is HPV testing, because that's a molecular test. If women self-sample, it can be done. And interestingly and paradoxically, the COVID pandemic has helped, because the COVID pandemic brought in molecular testing across previously underserved areas, or areas that wouldn't know what a molecular test was. So, for example, in India, PCR testing for COVID is available throughout the subcontinent. Now, that is a huge transformation, and it means that the community is used to sampling themselves because they have to sample for COVID testing. The healthcare professionals are used to molecular testing and what you need to do to keep a sample clean to go to the laboratory. They're used to sending stuff and receiving it. So there's already a pattern of activity established because of the COVID pandemic. But the pandemic is over as far as many people are concerned. So that's sort of falling back into abeyance. And one of the challenges that we face is actually harnessing that structure, harnessing that pattern of behavior, and getting a screening program established. But even if you screen and you detect and you do it to the best of your ability, if you can't treat it, why did you detect it? So alongside all these programs has to be training. And that's something I think that's been ignored. You have got to train the nurses, the healthcare professionals who treat the lesions. You may not be able to follow them up pathologically, but you can treat the lesions. And the other big development, which people ignore because it's not a medical development, are mobile phones. Just, go to the poorest countries in the world. Everybody has a mobile phone. And that means they have a self-identifier. And that means that you can send them a message saying, you need to go to your local clinic, or the healthcare worker will come to your village next week and you need to see them and have another test. So there are shoots on the horizon that things will work out, but they'll only work out if there's will. And they'll only work out if there's a very realistic appreciation of how much it's going to cost and how much it's going to take in organization and infrastructure. So I hope that's not too gloomy an outlook. As for treatment of cervical cancer, that is an entirely different issue, because that requires sophisticated medical intervention. It requires sophisticated equipment, sophisticated algorithms, and that's difficult to supply.
Thank you very much. We do have big challenges, don't we? And my next question is, can the three objectives be taken separately and countries calibrate their national programs to their existing resources?
Yes, and they have to make tough choices. When you're confronted with shall we vaccinate or shall we screen, because we can't afford to do both, then you have to ask yourself some very tough questions. Now, to me, the priority would be vaccination. The reason for that is that I am going to remove the cause of the disease, which I'm not with screening. Screening will deal with the women who are already infected and have lesions, providing they come for their sampling and testing and providing they're able to be treated. But vaccination, you immunize. If you immunize at high enough coverage, these vaccines are incredibly effective because they prevent infection. And that, I think, is not really widely understood or accepted. Why that is so important, because just immunizing a 9 to 10-year-old effectively prevents that girl or boy from getting infected, and it prevents them from transmitting the virus to a non-vaccinated, non-protected person. So vaccination, it's got a long-term effect, but it gets rid of the cause, and because of the huge effect on transmission, the herd immunity generated is massive. So you actually start to protect those marginalized communities that represent a reservoir of infection. So vaccination, it not just prevents disease, it actually prevents the infected agent from surviving. I think that's critical. Screening is an exponential increase in challenge because the resources needed, the infrastructure, and the availability of trained personnel is just that much greater. You can train people to immunize. In the COVID outbreak in the UK, we trained all sorts of people to put a needle into the deltoid and immunize. They didn't have medical training. They had a very brief training, but they could do it. And you could do the same with HPV vaccination. Now, that's not the same for screening. The women can self-sample, we can have molecular testing, but at the end of the day, you've got to have somebody who knows what they're doing to remove the lesion. And treatment, well, that's a question of money. And when you go to some African countries, they may have one center, if they have one at all, for as an oncology center, where they can deliver treatment to the whole range of cancers. So that's a very big ask. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't work towards it.
Thank you. I agree with you. The fundamental principle of infectious diseases is reducing that pool of circulating virus, and one can certainly do that with great vaccines. So my next question is, well, in high-income countries such as my own in Australia, we've already commenced with single dose. And I understand in the UK in mid-year, also one dose HPV vaccination is going to be the routine program. So what measures do you think should be put in place as an indicator to ensure any breakthroughs are recognised early and acted upon?
Well, in a high-income country, that's not too difficult to do because, for example, in the UK, we already have excellent surveillance. So you have cohorts of individuals who are followed for detection of HPV of the vaccine types and non-vaccine types. For example, in 16 and 18-year-olds in our chlamydia program, that cohort is the test cohort for HPV prevalence. And extraordinarily, in the 10 years that we've been vaccinating against HPV, HPV 16 is virtually eliminated from the 16-year-old population. Now that, it's gone down from about 25% to 0%. So following infection is probably the easiest way to monitor. But we also, of course, have excellent gynecological services and an excellent screening program. So we can monitor how many CIN3s are presenting and being treated, how many high-grade abnormal smears. So there is already data collection to monitor the effectiveness of the program. Now, one of the problems for a low-income country is that this ability to collect and collate data is not well developed. And that's again a huge gap that somehow we have to start filling. And the countries themselves recognize this, there's no doubt about it. They know their ability to collect data, to have the systems, the databases, and the analytic systems to review this data isn't there. Registries are not so common on the ground, and they're again critical. So it's a question of getting your cohorts that you're going to follow, and I think infection, having systems in which the vaccine registries talk to the cytology registries. That again, Australia has that, and that's been extremely valuable. So it's pretty standard public health measures. I'd look for the infection, look for the disease. As soon as you see any change in prevalence, act.
Thank you, and thank you for preempting the second question. So my next question to you, you mentioned before about boys in programs, and in fact, over 30 countries have already included boys. Would you like to comment on that in the WHO campaign?
Yes, well, I think, full disclosure, I am a strong advocate for the immunization of boys, not just on the basis of equality, because I think this is an issue of equal treatment. I keep saying this is an equal opportunities virus. It doesn't distinguish between male and female, or whatever gender you are. It doesn't much care. So that's the first thing. Secondly, there are enough studies now to show that unless you get to a certain vaccine coverage, you do not have the herd immunity benefits. And the herd immunity benefits are critical with HPV. And so there are countries where the coverage is only 30% for the first dose in girls. Now, the phase 4 studies in Finland showed that even with that sort of low coverage, if you included boys in the equation, then you started to impact on virus prevalence. So it is worth it to have boys in there, because if your prevalence falls or if your coverage falls, then boys are more robust in their long-term immune response, it would appear. But if you're only doing girls and there's a blip in the program and it falls from an 80% coverage to a 40% coverage, if you've had boys in the program, then there is virtually little impact on the prevalence of HPV infection. You keep your vaccine protection up. If boys aren't there, it falls. So that's another important issue. This is the resilience in the program. And that was an important factor, I think, in the UK, that, whatever happened, if you had boys in there, the program remained resilient. And it's those marginalized groups, refugees, sex workers, trans individuals, all the people out on the side of society who do not normally participate in public health measures. This is where herd immunity really matters, because this is the way you protect those groups, and this is the way you keep your program effective. So there are very good reasons for including boys. Now, the counter argument is that if you have a high enough coverage, then, and that means 70% at least, then you will protect boys as well as girls. But you'll only protect those boys who are having sex with girls or having sex with people who have sex with women at some point in their lives. So it doesn't do the coverage. It doesn't give you the blanket coverage you need. It doesn't give you what a national immunization program should deliver, effectiveness. So
I guess these days, with the communities, the young people traveling so much, once they go outside the herd, they're not protected.
Absolutely. And also, we've had dramatic change in attitudes. And can I put it this way? We are more gender fluid as a society. And so there is a lot of exchange of partners of different proclivities. And you can't shut your eyes to that. You just have to do something that is effective for the whole population, not just a part of it.
Thank you. So the next question is the impact of HIV in the success of the HPV vaccine programs in these populations as well. Would you like to comment on that, please, Margaret?
This always seems to me to be the elephant in the room, particularly for one dose, if you like. So the question is really, if you immunize against HPV in an HIV-infected individual, is your immune response effective enough to last? This is a question about duration of protection as much as about the quality of protection. Now, all the studies that have been done show that you get seroconversion to pretty well the same rates. Your antibody titers are good enough, but they haven't followed them up long enough to find out what the impact of HIV seropositivity is when you deliver an HPV vaccine. And that, I think, is the crucial question. Now, in terms of these big programs where we're immunizing 9 to 14-year-olds across the world, I don't think there's a big problem there, because the 9 to 14-year-olds, even in the high endemicity areas, tend to be seronegative. They don't acquire HIV until they start their sexual lives. So if you immunize them against HPV at 9, their immune system is up and running, their memory is established in an immunocompetent environment. That the difference between them and someone who's already HIV positive is that when you immunize them, it's in an immunoderegulated environment. And even if they're on antiretrovirals, immune reconstitution in HIV-infected individuals is not perfect. So I want to know I want to see big trials in which this question is addressed. What is the impact of immunizing against HPV in an HIV seropositive population? And you'll only see it if you start to immunize girls in their late teens and early 20s. But it's a key question. I actually think that immunizing before HIV seroconversion is going to be okay, because B-cell memory is very robust and doesn't seem to have the same dependence on T cells. It's an immunological question. It's not a public health question in a way. But we'll only know if we do the investigation, do the trials. But that's the question. And it's a huge question in places like South Africa, where they have such a high prevalence of HIV, and the associated Sub-Saharan countries. But since they're immunizing their 9-year-olds, I think that's okay. It's when you start immunizing already seropositive individuals whose T cell count is not optimal.
So given you've just given us an immunological point of view, I wanted to finish off with one last question, one curly question, I guess. I mean, given over the years, we've all been taught prime boosting regimens, and can you explain simply to the audience, well, why is it that one dose works with HPV vaccines?
Well, HPV vaccines have some special properties. And the first is the particle. Now, particulates induce very strong immune responses. So that's the first thing. And I'll talk a bit about the particle in more detail. The second is the actual biology of the virus. And everybody forgets this in their discussions about what the immune system's doing. It's also does the virus infect? How is it a rapid process? Or does it take a long time to infect? This is a non-inflammatory virus. In other words, it's not cytolytic, so it doesn't kill any cells. So when it naturally infects, it's silent. So there aren't any signals to the immune system, something bad going on in the epithelium. Now, the particle is, if you could design an optimal antigen, it would be the HPV VLP. It's the right size at 50 nanometers, and it's got this extraordinary structure where each of the L1 molecules are assembled into a pentamer, and they stud the surface rather like a cannonball studded with little prongs. And each of those prongs has the L1 epitope that the B cell is going to see, and against which it will generate antibodies. Now, those epitopes are spaced absolutely optimally. Yonks ago, 20 years ago, it was shown that spacing between epitopes on an antigen was critical in determining how strong the response was. So here we've got this VLP. It's got an optimal size. It's got an optimal display of the epitopes, the immunogenic epitopes across the surface. And it's delivered in an optimal way. Because one of the things you might say is, well, if this VLP is so wonderful, why on earth doesn't natural infection with it engender the same response? Well, it's not just the antigen that matters, it's the context in which you deliver it. Because everything with vaccines depends on the first 4 to 5 days, when the immune system is being presented with the information and it's getting its troops ready to go out and defend the body. So if it has to be in an inflammatory milieu in which the messages that are telling the immune system respond are the optimal messages. And that's what you get when you go into the deltoid with a VLP and an adjuvant. The adjuvant is very important, whether it's alum or the modified TLR agonist adjuvants. They're crucial because they shape the response and they shape the intensity of the response. Now, there's a view to which I subscribe, I have to say, that first interaction between antigen and B cell has to reach a certain threshold. If it reaches that threshold, then all the events you want are set into play. That's the prime. If it doesn't reach that threshold, you're going to have to come in again with a second go and boost. Now, with one dose with a VLP vaccine, you reach that antigenic threshold for the regions I've just discussed. So you generate not just enough antibody, but the right sort of antibody, with a high affinity, a high ability to bind to the epitope in an information bubble, which allows this to happen. Now, will it be sustained? That's the other question. Well, there's something very interesting about particulate vaccines. They hang about. So the particles are trapped on follicular dendritic cells in the lymph node for some considerable time. And again, this was shown yonks ago. So it's the confluence of all these things. And then the biology of the vaccine, of the virus. This virus requires you to wound the surface, at least in the genital tract, wound the surface of the epithelium, leaving the basement membrane. And that's what the virus attaches to. Now, this all takes about 24 hours. That's long enough for any antibody that's around in the circulation to be out by movement into the diffusion into the wound space and neutralize. So it's a combination of factors which make prime alone enough for this vaccine. You don't need to boost, might help, I don't know, but you don't need to boost. And the proof of that pudding is not me talking about the theoretical immunology. It's the data coming from the trials, particularly the Kenshi trial, which I believe is to report at the meeting we're at now. So, yeah, one dose works, and it works for good immunological reasons, and it actually works because we've shown it works.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. That was a brilliant answer and a brilliant presentation. And I'd like to again thank you and congratulate you. And I noticed you have your tools of trade there. In the years of learning about the immunology of HPV, it was a great analogy. And I'd really like to thank you on behalf of everyone here for all of the work you've put into especially education of the community as well as IPVS. And congratulations again.
Thank you so much. And I want to say what a privilege and honor it is to receive this award from the papillomavirus community, of whom I've been a member for a long time, but also because it's the Hilleman Award. And, you know, the world's children, oh, Maurice Hilleman, a huge, huge thank you. Millions of them are alive today because of Hilleman's vaccines. And that's, I think, the message we should all take home with us. But thank you.
Thank you.